There is a weird problem with AI coding tools right now. They can build an entire website in minutes. They can write the React components, create the layout, add animations, make everything responsive, and somehow the result still looks like AI made it. You know the look: huge rounded cards, purple gradients, perfectly centered hero sections, generic SaaS copy. And that same slightly futuristic design that somehow appears in almost every AI generated landing page. The problem is no longer that AI cannot build interfaces. The problem is that AI has defaults, and those defaults are becoming extremely easy to recognize. But there is an open source tool trying to fix exactly this. It is called Impeccable, and its latest version introduces something much more interesting than another collection of prompts. It gives AI agents something they are usually terrible at: a design vocabulary. So let's unpack how it works. Impeccable describes itself as the missing design vocabulary for agents. And that description is actually pretty accurate, because most coding agents already know how to write CSS. Claude Code does not need another tutorial explaining what padding is. It already knows how to build a navbar. It knows what a grid is. It knows how to create a button. The problem happens one level above that: taste, hierarchy, restraint, knowing when something should be louder and when it should disappear into the background, knowing when a page feels too symmetrical, when the typography has no character, or when a design technically works but somehow still feels completely generic. That is the layer Impeccable is trying to add. Instead of giving Claude one giant design prompt, Impeccable gives it a collection of structured design operations. Things like bolder, quieter, polish, typeset, animate, colorize, simplify, and several others. There are more than 20 of these commands covering different parts of the design process. And that matters because saying, "make this better," is actually a terrible design instruction. Better in what way? More dramatic, more minimal, more readable, more premium, less crowded? Impeccable turns those vague instincts into instructions an agent can actually act on. But there is another part of this project that I think is even more interesting. Impeccable has documented dozens of patterns that commonly make AI-generated interfaces look artificial. Basically, an AI design anti-pattern list, and some of them are painfully familiar. The obvious gradients: too many cards, excessive rounded corners, weak typography, everything being centered, random decorative blobs, over-designed dashboards, UI elements floating inside UI elements floating inside even more UI elements. Individually, none of these things are necessarily bad. The problem is that language models have seen them so many times that they tend to reach for them by default. So when thousands of people ask an AI, "build me a modern SaaS landing page," the models keep converging toward the same visual answer. This is really the core idea behind Impeccable. It is not trying to teach Claude how CSS works. It is trying to stop Claude from choosing the most statistically obvious design every single time. And version 4 makes that process much more visual. The first major feature is called worlds. Imagine you tell an AI agent, "build me a landing page for an analytics company." Normally, the agent makes a bunch of decisions immediately: dark or light, serif or sans serif, dense or minimal, editorial or futuristic, corporate or experimental. And unless your prompt is extremely detailed, you probably do not see those decisions until the page has already been built. Worlds changes that. Instead of committing immediately to one design direction, Impeccable can present multiple visual directions first. Think of them almost like parallel design universes. The same product, but interpreted through completely different aesthetics. Maybe one version feels like an old scientific instrument, another looks like an editorial magazine, another feels like a terminal interface, another is extremely minimal. You see the directions visually, then you choose. And this sounds like a small workflow improvement, but it solves one of the biggest problems with AI design. Prompting is terrible for describing taste. Most people cannot describe exactly why they like a website. But if you show them 6 designs, they can immediately say, "that one." This is much closer to how humans actually make creative decisions. Selection is easier than specification. And once you choose a world, the system can go one level deeper. Instead of immediately producing one final page, it can generate variations inside that direction. So the workflow becomes: first choose the design language, then choose the composition, then refine the details. That is much better than the usual AI workflow: prompt, wait, hate the result, write another paragraph explaining why you hate it, wait again, and repeat. The world's workflow turns that giant search space into a sequence of smaller decisions. And that brings us to the second major feature: live mode. This is probably the feature that makes Impeccable feel least like a normal Claude Code skill. You can launch your project in the browser and interact with the design visually. You pick an element, maybe the hero headline, maybe a card, maybe a button, and instead of going back to the terminal and carefully explaining which element you are talking about, you simply select it. Then you can ask for a transformation, make it bolder, make it quieter, polish it, change the typography, or generate multiple variations, and suddenly the workflow starts to look much more like a design tool than a coding assistant. This is important because there are really two different scales of AI design work. There are macro decisions and micro decisions. Macro decisions are things like change the entire visual direction, rebuild the hero, use a completely different reference, change the layout philosophy. Those are still better handled through Claude Code and normal prompting. But micro decisions are different. This button feels weak. This heading needs more character. This section is too busy. The spacing here feels wrong. Those tiny visual judgments are where repeatedly jumping between your browser and terminal becomes annoying. Live mode gives you a much tighter iteration loop. Pick, generate, compare, accept, continue. And for design work, iteration speed matters almost as much as generation quality. There is also a very important detail here. Impeccable is not really a magic one-shot website generator, and I think treating it like one would completely miss the point. There are plenty of AI design tools that can produce something impressive from one prompt, but often they have a recognizable style. You keep using the tool, and eventually you realize it keeps making different versions of basically the same website. That can give the tool a very high floor. Your first result looks good, but it also gives it a relatively low ceiling because you are trapped inside the aesthetic the tool already knows. Impeccable is almost the opposite. It gives you a design process, which means the first generation is not necessarily supposed to be the final product. You choose a direction, you generate variations, you refine individual components, you bring in references, you change your mind, you iterate. And because the system is more general, the final result can move much further away from the default AI aesthetic, but only if you actually direct it. And this is where reference images become extremely powerful. Let's say Impeccable creates a clean modern landing page. It looks good, but it still isn't your taste. Instead of spending 10 minutes trying to convert visual intuition into text, you can show Claude an interface you actually like. Maybe it has an ASCII-inspired aesthetic. Maybe it looks like an old operating system. Maybe it uses brutalist typography. Maybe it feels like a luxury editorial site. Now Claude has a concrete visual direction. Impeccable gives it the vocabulary and constraints to interpret that reference without immediately falling back into the usual AI defaults. This combination is probably the workflow I find most interesting. References for the big creative direction, Claude Code for structural changes, Impeccable Live for local refinement, and Impeccable's design rules acting like a quality layer across the whole process. That is a much more realistic model for AI-assisted design than simply typing, "Make me a beautiful website." Getting started is also fairly simple. Impeccable is open source, and the installation can be handled through its CLI. Once installed, you initialize it inside your project. It asks what you are building, what stack you are using, and what information or references you already have. From there, the system can start building the design context around your project. And depending on your workflow, you can also connect external image generation tools through MCP integrations to help generate visual assets or explore different directions. But the most important part is not any specific integration. It is the loop. Generate options, choose a direction, build, review, then refine. And that is why I think Impeccable is interesting beyond just Claude Code. AI coding is entering a strange phase. Generating more code is becoming less impressive. Models are already very good at that. The harder problem is controlling what they generate, giving agents better judgment, better constraints, better vocabulary, and better feedback loops. Impeccable is basically applying that idea to design. Instead of trying to make the model more intelligent, it improves the environment around the model. It gives Claude more structured ways to think about visual decisions. And maybe that is where a lot of the next improvements in coding agents will come from. Not bigger prompts, not another model, but better systems around the model. Because Claude already knows how to build the website. The difficult part is teaching it when the website looks bad. And Impeccable might be one of the best attempts at solving that problem right now.